Greetings all, and welcome back. I recently published a response to a video by Alex O'Connor here on this channel, and it ended up being my most hated video of all time. That's the kind of momentum a man would be a fool not to run with. So, I'm here to talk about atheism. Again, only this time, rather than offering an apologetic defense of Christianity from the charges of atheism, I want to make a video indicating some of the reasons that I am not an atheist. And still further, why I believe that atheism is inadequate as a worldview. And yes, friends, despite many of the very strong statements to the contrary in the comments to my last video, atheism is a worldview. More on that to come. What follows is meant to be a general critique of atheism from the point of view of theism, broadly understood. It is not meant on the whole to support any specific theistic position or any specific religion, though I think some of the points that I'm going to make will suggest differences or hierarchies between the various religions or spiritual ideas. Here I mean simply to indicate a few of the places where I believe that atheism and the atheistic approach to the world is inferior to the theistic. Needless to say, I intend none of this as knockdown foolproof proof, though I believe that cumulatively it is at least strongly suggestive. But I'll come back to that at the end of this video. Now, I'd like to begin with a statement by one of the commentators from my last video. This commentator posed some really excellent questions, and he ended his comments with an observation. He observed that one of the points of possible common ground from which both atheists and theists can commence in their conversations on the question of theism versus atheism might be empiricism, the empirical. To read his comments directly, at the end of your video, you offer an olive branch in peace, and I take you at your word, and I fully agree. I don't know what a bridge would look like, but I think part of it would be empiricism. While acknowledging that any of our senses may fail at times to report accurately, most of the rest of us will have our senses functioning well enough to report accurately. So where do we go from there? Maybe look at what those accurate observations lead us to predict about the world and the cosmos around us, and then settle on what goals we have. But now we're talking politics. Now, I happen to agree with him, but at the same time I also happen to believe that empiricism in particular is perhaps one of the bitterest bones of contention between us. See, there's what I would call a kind of empirical divide between atheists and theists, which renders our conversations with one another, our dialogue, that much spinier and more difficult. Theists are very often theists, though of course not always, precisely on account of experiences that they have had. Experiences which they believe cannot be explained, or cannot be explained adequately, by atheism. These experiences are either not accessible to the atheist, or they are explained away by the atheist in a way which seems to deny their essence. Namely as illusion, hallucination, misinterpretation, brain fever. So it seems to me that one of the most pressing points of dispute between atheists and theists is precisely how we understand the empirical. What we take to be actual empirical evidence for any given claim, and how we assess this empirical evidence, on what grounds, and by what light. And I can use this as a segue into what seems to me to be one of the first and most telling of atheism's failures in its attempt to understand the world. Atheism cannot explain the existence of the very matrix in which our experience takes place. Atheism cannot explain the existence of human consciousness. Many atheists seem to want to outright deny the existence of our interior world as such. Materialistic atheism really seems to me hopelessly self-contradictory in this regard. It attempts to produce a coherent materialistic account of the world through a faculty which is experientially non-material. Now, other kinds of atheism, which maintain some room for other kinds of forces or phenomena, do not suffer from so blatant a self-contradiction. The question, of course, is whether they are actually able to give an account of consciousness, or if they are constrained merely to leaving the question unanswered. Now, some atheists are actually content to simply leave the question open, either indefinitely or at least until science can work its magic and come up with a suitable account. And I think that this kind of agnosticism on this particular point is actually the most self-consistent position that an atheist today can take. For of course, it would be absurd to insist that the atheist should for some reason be able to explain all of the mysteries of the universe, and to answer all of its questions. The problem only really arises when there is another view of the world which explains phenomena that the atheist is unable to explain, because this would suggest limitations in the atheist's view. Now, theism offers explanations for the soul. It offers explanations for consciousness. The atheist, particularly if he is strongly scientifically minded, might be inclined to deny the validity of these explanations. But he can't deny that these explanations are given and that they seem to make sense to a great many more philosophically minded people. So the atheist does have an interest, insofar as it's possible to him, to offer better explanations for this phenomenon, which in this case would mean more scientific explanations. These kinds of explanations will most often come down to the attempt to explain consciousness as a kind of evolutionary phenomenon or epiphenomenon. something which results from or accompanies the evolutionary development of that animal known as the human beings. And I think following this train of thought, the atheist can actually give a fairly coherent account of the human being as a kind of sophisticated machine or robot. He will apply the terms of our common language, things like hunger, desire, fear, love, etc., to various internal physiological mechanisms. He will even be able to render much of this in strictly mathematical terms. But the one thing he will not be able to do is explain how any of this should have actually become conscious, or how these chemical and physiological events that he's able to isolate and define differ from the conscious events which seem to accompany them, or even what consciousness itself is. His explanation of consciousness, whatever form that might specifically take, will locate consciousness at the tail end of a long process, a long course of development, probably an evolutionary course of development. Consciousness, by this view, is an issuing forth from the lesser, the more basic, and the more primitive, to the more complex and sophisticated. And the question emerges here, can consciousness actually be explained in this way? Can it be explained as an evolutionary development from the less to the more complex? Or must we finally conclude that it is necessarily a movement of the high to the low? This would be, more or less, a summation of most theistic approaches to this question. Theism tends to interpret the world as a kind of hierarchy which emanates downward from the Godhead. Evolution tends to see the world as a composite of elements or pieces which, all working in assembly in accordance with laws, build towards something that's higher. And if we phrase the problem in this way, we can see that the problem of consciousness might, from an atheistic perspective, be regarded merely as a subset of the problem of life. Now, I think I can go out on a limb here and say that the overwhelming majority of atheists today will attempt to explain life as the consequence of various evolutionary mechanisms, evolutionary courses of development over time. There might be some holdouts here and there, probably some interesting cases that I'd enjoy talking to. So if you're out there, write me down in the comments. But most atheists, I think, are happy to subscribe to the evolutionary scientific explanation for the variety of living beings that we find around us today. Now, the power of the evolutionary explanation is that it demands no sudden or great leaps in the origin or the development of life. Life can be explained as a kind of cumulative elaboration of myriad small stages or steps over enormous arcs of time. It's like if you take enough toothpicks and you throw them over the side of a cliff, day in and day out for billions of years, one day they'll make a skyscraper. Alright, it's not like that at all. It's like if you took enough magical toothpicks that wanted to make a skyscraper, toothpicks that contained in themselves the building plans for a skyscraper. So this is all obviously tongue-in-cheek, but it does indicate one of my problems with the evolutionary view. The cumulative addition of countless small steps obscures the fact that beneath each of these steps individually, and certainly underneath all of them globally, is a kind of thrust, a directionality, a tendency, a teleology, which governs not only the actions of living beings, but their very internal order and structure. The development of an animal from a mere grouping of cells already indicates a certain end-driven or purposeful activity, an aiming toward a complete form, and a form more or less which is already implicit in the group of cells itself. It's very difficult to explain life and living creatures without reference to teleology. But science, for reasons of its methodology, eschews teleology. The devotees of science very often want to claim that teleology doesn't exist, because science can't get its hooks into teleology. Now, this is a quick overview of a complicated problem. Teleology is much discussed in scientific circles, particularly, not surprisingly, within biology. I think it's at least safe to say, however, that there's a kind of bias against teleology in science. There's an unwillingness to refer to purpose or to anything that's end-driven. Thanks, however, to the kind of explanation which is deployed by evolution, the scientific or scientistic thinker has an easy way out here. Everything about living organisms which can be explained scientifically is clearly scientific. Everything which cannot be so explained will be one day. It simply hasn't been discovered yet, or the evidence for it hasn't become clear, or it hasn't been submitted to scientific inquiry in the right way. But science will be able to explain everything one day. Now, I don't believe that this is an error to which all atheists fall prey, but I think it is one to which they seem to be especially prone, particularly in the context of attempting to understand the nature of life. And I think the problem here should be clear enough. Atheists often like, and not always wrongly, to take theists to task for introducing the so-called God of the gaps. But they are perfectly willing to assign to science an analogous role. It's not yet perfectly clear how a given animal developed wings and came to fly, or developed eyes and came to see, or developed reproductive organs and came to reproduce. But these things will become evident one day. Science will make them evident. We know this because science. Science, 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 science. science, science. And who knows, maybe they're right. Time will tell. But in the meantime, supposing that science will discover things that it hasn't already discovered seems strangely parallel to an act of faith. Now, the problem of life has another aspect to it, and that comes in the strange disparity between living things in the world and inanimate things in the world. The question emerges quite spontaneously. How is it possible that any category of things in the universe might begin to act not only without reference to, but even clearly and directly against the major trends of the universe? So, we live in a universe which is governed by entropy, but life is inherently and essentially anti-entropic. It is negentropic, because the first word we came up with to describe an ugly thing wasn't ugly enough. We have to invent an even uglier word to describe the beautiful thing. Oh, modernity. But I digress. Life acts continuously and, as it were, desperately against the entropic forces of the universe. It appears to be a kind of great counter-movement against the way things usually go. And it's presumed by science that this movement emerged spontaneously, as a kind of indirect result of those same forces which it then moved against. This life, according to the going ideas, was entirely unintended, and it built upon itself over time, until finally coming to our own predicament today, where we, as animals, trapped within this kind of weird consciousness which came into being for reasons that we're not really able to explain, have to look back at the whole mess and wonder what in the world happened here. How is it possible that we came to this point? How did we emerge as animals among animals? Are we simply the highest and most sophisticated rung of an evolutionary ladder? Does this really offer us a satisfactory exposition of life as we experience it? Does it reflect our most immediate and lived experience of the world as living and conscious beings? In my view, it doesn't quite cut it. It seems to leave off too much. In my view, it offers simply another example of where the atheist position must overlay extraneous rationales onto human experience as we actually experience it. See, I would argue that the atheist is fundamentally at odds with himself, and I'll come back to this. But first, I want to come to a still deeper problem for the atheist position, the problem of being. Why is there something rather than nothing? And why should that something that is be an ordered something with qualities and characteristics that make it articulable? The atheist cannot answer this question. The atheist must accept the toothpick, must bow before the toothpick. The atheist is constrained to accept the existence of the cosmos as a great, idiotic datum. It's just a given, somehow, for some reason. The atheist can articulate the world as world, but he cannot explain why there should be such a world, or why this world should be articulable. Now, we often hear a related objection to atheism.
Do you really believe that all of this just came about by chance?
Where all of this means order, harmony, emotions, structure, beauty, life, trivial things. And honestly, while there's a certain force to that question, I think it's actually missing the fundamental point here. The point is not that all of this came about by chance. The point is almost even the contrary. The point is that it came about in accordance with previously extant laws and order-bringing patterns. It's not the accidental or arbitrary nature of the universe, but its determinacy, its order, and its inner coherency, which is the fundamentally and inexplicably mysterious thing. I mean, the existence of a cosmos ruled continually by chance and by flux would be easier to understand, from an outside perspective, naturally, than is the existence of a cosmos which is governed by law, structure, and rational pattern. If an ordered cosmos simply is, that makes for an impenetrable enigma. But if it is the way that it is, because it was made so by a creative divinity, its existence, and its existence in this way precisely, become explicable in the light of that divinity. Now, the atheist rightly objects to this. Very well, but you only moved the question back a step. Rather than letting the mystery reside where we find it, which is to say in our immediate experience of the world, you've arbitrarily shifted that mystery onto the back of a God about whom the same questions must be asked. Why is God intelligent, rational, and ordered? Why does God exist at all? And I think that this atheistic objection has weight for a great many theistic positions, but I don't think it's taking the deepest theistic claim seriously enough. It stops up short with the world that we can understand. It attempts to comprehend God, whatever God might be, as a subset of the cosmos that we live in, rather than as its transcendent architect. It acts as though God were simply another fact or facet of creation, an ordered thing that exists somewhere in the world. But God, as creator of the world, naturally encompasses and transcends the world. Any category that we might use to understand the world, even things as basic as time and space, existence and non-existence, being and non-being, cannot bind the creator of the world in the same way that they bind the things of the world. And this is why the mystics have a habit of coming out with some pretty bizarre remarks. I mean, some of it's just downright hairy. They have declared, for instance, that God exists beyond existence, that he is beyond being and non-being, that he at once is and is not. These seem like blatant contradictions to our limited human capacities, but they're attempting to put into a language limited by the possibilities of our created state the condition of a creator who is not bound by those possibilities. He's not bound by those possibilities for the simple reason that he created them. What have I told you? My ducks like theological discussions. We can have an intuition for why such a creator divinity would be beyond our comprehension. We can give a coherent account of why such a divinity would be beyond our understanding, albeit an account which is limited by the limits of our human existence. But we cannot give a rational account of why a world underpinned by nothing should be at all, not to speak of its being orderly. The theist account, one might say, provides the space for an explicable inexplicability. The atheist account grants us merely an inexplicable inexplicability, a mystery without any hope of resolution. And the consequence of this, to my mind, is profound. All things in the atheistic view are necessarily bounded by a liminal darkness, a fundamental enigma which cannot be transgressed. The lights of human reason cannot carry us hence, because the lights of human reason depend on the enigma. We cannot get outside of the world as world to look back in on it. We can't step outside of existence to see it from afar. And nor do we have any kind of access to any kind of wisdom or any kind of transcendent revelation which comes from that outside perspective. We are doomed to ignorance. Our human rationality is constrained to a kind of final and root futility. By the theist view, on the other hand, at least any theist view which includes the idea of a creator deity properly understood, the strangeness of things even takes on a kind of consoling dimension. Because behind this strangeness there lies a God. And not only a God, but a God who evidently has some kind of deliberate purpose in the creation of this strange world in which we find ourselves. We can entrust ourselves to a consciousness which is so much vaster than our own, that even the word consciousness itself is but a feeble attempt at metaphor. There is, by the theist account, even the possibility of our potentially one day understanding the mystery behind existence itself, by our growth in consciousness toward God. If not in this life, then in the life to come. So the cosmos of the theist is bounded by light, precisely where the atheist is bounded by darkness. And it's my view that this seemingly peripheral or random problem actually stands at the root of atheism's inevitable connection to nihilism. That's right, let me say it again for all you out there in the back row. Atheism is nihilistic, and nowhere can this better be seen than in the problem of morality. I simply do not see how the fragile blooms of human morality can long survive in the torrid desert of the atheistic outlook. Now, to be clear, I think the atheist is as able as the next man to give a coherent account for human morality, why it exists, what purpose it might serve on the social or evolutionary level, why it might be necessary for the continuation of our societies and even our species. I even might go so far as to say that atheists, on account of their special perspective, might be able to grant us insights into the unfolding of morality that we might not otherwise have had. I think, for example, of Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality. But be all of this as it may, atheism can never explain to me why I, John Bruce Leonard, or you, whoever you happen to be, should individually submit to the dictates or expectations of any given social morality. It can never explain to me why I should not take advantage of any unprincipled opportunity that comes my way. It can't explain to me why, if I can get away scot-free with theft or murder, I shouldn't. And it can't do this because it totally divorces morality from all sense of cosmic purpose. It detaches morality from the whole intricate web of final and eschatological meanings, without which morality is really nothing but a set of arbitrary, non-binding social rules. Morality, by the atheist outlook, is necessarily relegated to the realm of what is pragmatic for the social order. But at those key moments when what is pragmatic for the social order come into conflict with what is pragmatic or desirable to me personally, atheism remains silent. And indeed, even about what is specifically pragmatic for the social order, atheism remains silent. The theoretical necessity of some morality for society certainly does not indicate which morality would be best for any given society. Even reviewing those societies which have so far existed, we can see a great variety of different views about what human beings should or should not do, or the way that they should or should not live. Some societies are all about nudity, some about prudity. Some societies cherish girls and disabled children. Some leave them out on hills to die. Some societies have tolerated or even favored homosexuality. Some have considered it a punishable offense. Some societies allow us to openly debate the question of theism versus atheism. Some have not hesitated to banish or execute atheists. And those societies were not only the most common in human history, but they also seem to do just fine from the evolutionary perspective. I mean, just saying. So how do we adjudicate between these different views? What should be our standard, and why? And how can any atheist even settle on such a standard in any real sense? Now, when facing this question, I think that a great many atheists might tend to try to find that social order which is best able to promote the evolutionary success of human beings, whatever that might be. Social Darwinism is, of course, an early and crude form of this attempt. Eugenics is a later and sadly far more sophisticated example. Now, I think that all of this is fundamentally wrong-headed, even by the atheist view, for the simple reason that, by the atheist view, no ought can come from any is. You cannot infer what a person or a society should do from any fact of the world surrounding us. Now, I happen to disagree with this view profoundly, but I also happen to think that it's inevitable for the atheist. The atheist is faced with a variety of social orders, all of which more or less effectively work toward the common good. And he has no standard by which to actively discriminate among them, apart, of course, from the atheist's personal tastes, or those views which align most intimately with the atheist's own desires and ambitions. His choice of political philosophy is somewhat equivalent to his choice of his favorite ice cream flavor, unless, of course, he is, like Sam Harris, quixotically intent on producing a rigorously atheist and scientific morality. Which you're able to do if, like Sam Harris, your eyes are so close together that you can't see beyond your own nose. But really, on a more serious note, any attempt to produce a scientific morality will inevitably reduce to a kind of pleading for the common favor. You're trying to find something that most people can agree on most of the time. And that might work most of the time, but it's in the exceptions that political theories are best tested. By the atheist's view, morality inevitably resolves either to a half-hearted and groundless attempt to recover a kind of scientific foundation for morality, or else to the atheist's naked self-interest. Now, does this mean that every atheist is going to be something like a moral monster? Of course not. There are, of course, many decent, altruistic, and moral atheists in this world. I would even say that there are probably more of them than the contrary. But I would also say that they are so by accident. They are so because they happen to be raised in societies which have historically been Christian, and which, to this day, reflect the residual influences of Christianity. That is to say, societies which, for this very heritage, favor decency, altruism, and morality. Atheists are good people because they happen to be, either by personality or by upbringing, that kind of person. Lucky them, and lucky us. What about those who are not so lucky? What happens when, over the course of time, the moralities which have traditionally governed our Western societies begin to erode more quickly? What happens when the underpinnings for our traditional moralities fall to pieces, and there's no longer any real standard which governs or unifies our societies? This is not a trivial point. It has ramifications for any number of contemporary problems. On the one hand, we're seeing a kind of breakdown of a social integration, a kind of fragmentation of our societies into factions and interest groups. And the defining feature of this situation is that there is no common ground upon which they all stand. The common morality which once bound them has begun to evaporate. And it is, at the least, extremely difficult to see how atheism can address that particular problem. Furthermore, we live in times which are increasingly ruled by a class of individuals who believe that they have the right to ruthlessly and selfishly seek their own personal ambitions and gain, at the expense of any number of lesser individuals. Now, such political and economic egoists exist in all places and all times. And I certainly don't mean to say that atheism is somehow responsible for bringing them into the world. But I do see that the atheist view, and its embattled relation to morality, is especially propitious for the amoral, the heartlessly ambitious, the sociopathic and the psychopathic among us. It provides a kind of atmosphere in which such individuals can breathe and move with liberty, unencumbered by the inconvenient weight of theistic moralities and traditional moral values. And in this way, in its almost inevitable insistence on morality as a purely pragmatic social convention, atheism paradoxically favors a kind of social order which is governed by individuals who scorn the common good, save, of course, as it happens to coincide with their own hungers and lusts. That makes for a tremendous political problem, and I for one have not seen any convincing atheist attempt to address it. If I'm missing such a thing, please, by all means, in the comments below, let me know, point me to it, because I would be most interested in seeing such a thing. Now, continuing with this problem of morality, there's a deeper and, I think for the atheist, still more personal snag. The best atheists are motivated by a laudable and serious concern for the truth. They want to see the world for what it is, unveiled of any happy illusions or pleasant falsehoods, and truly, all honor to this. But at the same time, I believe that the atheist also cannot provide a justification for his own noble willingness to face painful truths. He might be able to show how certain kinds of truth can, once more pragmatically, add to his well-being or to the well-being of society. But what about those that simply don't? What about those truths which do nothing other than hurt? Would it not be best to just simply remain in denial about such truths? Is there any reason not to? Any reason under the sun? I mean, let's take, as just a hypothetical example, an individual who is so personally invested in his individual religion that to lose his belief would be for him a catastrophe, would be tantamount to losing his purpose in the world, his reason for existing. Now, I hardly see how the atheist could convincingly argue from atheism that such a person should become an atheist, despite the fact that his becoming an atheist will cause him nothing but suffering and hardship. Isn't the atheist constrained to accept that each one of us must simply choose which truths we're going to accept and which we're going to reject? Even and especially given the truth of atheism? On a wider scale, can the atheist really object to the beautiful or the noble lie? Can he object to the leaders of a society using untruths to maintain peace and prosperity in their societies? And what if such lies were to include religious lies? What if a religious lie, the conscious imposition of a false religion on society, could help to attenuate some of the problems that I pointed to in the atheistic political view? What if religion itself could be shown as a constructive or edifying fable, or at least certain kinds of religion? Something which might encourage the flourishing of societies and of human beings. On the whole, can the atheist offer me any kind of a reason why any of this should be avoided or contested? I mean, truly, as an atheist, I think that you have to come to terms with the fact that the few examples of explicitly atheistic government that we've had in the course of our history haven't exactly been shining paradises. I think in order to address this question, the atheist has to take very seriously prior social orders, all of which were religious through and through. The notion of a secular society is still very, very young, and it's even a question to what extent it's actually been tried. The atheist would have to be able to take his own impressive intellectual courage to confront the age-old theologico-political problem. But sadly, the atheist is hindered in this. He's held up by his own almost paraplegic approach to the problem of history. And with this problem, we come full circle. The atheist is natively, thoroughly, and emphatically an empiricist. He likes clear facts, hard data, and concrete evidence, things that he can get his hands around. He surrounds himself continually by such rigid and immobile furnishings, perhaps because they reassure him, perhaps because they make him feel safer in a world which is bounded so strongly by enigma and mystery. I'll leave that as a mere passing question of conscience for at least some of my atheistic friends out there. Be all of that as it may, the great majority of the atheists' arguments against theism will boil down, in the last analysis, to the charge that theism is unable to provide evidence for its particular claims, or at least sufficient evidence. This evidence, the atheist understands, must be of a rigorously scientific character. It must be evidence which can be submitted to the scientific method. Otherwise, it runs the risk of being merely anecdotal, subjective, personal. The atheist will accept this kind of evidence, and only this kind of evidence, and he might even get a little cranky if anything else is offered. And out of all of this emerges the intriguing paradox that the atheist, that great champion of the empirical, is quite prepared to simply dismiss out of hand tremendous swaths of human experience. This is probably nowhere so visible as in his special approach to history. He looks at the past, and he sees the vast majority of human beings entangled in what he must view as error, delusion, superstition, misinterpretation, humbug, gumbledygook, and gimbeldydricken. And when looking upon this remarkable panorama of human confusion, he does not seek to understand these past human beings as they understood themselves, for the very good reason that, to his view, they were deluded. Still less does he try to see what he might be able to learn from them. His aim is exclusively to offer explanations for how such astounding and abysmal ignorance might ever have been possible. His view of the past is not that of a humble investigator, but an arrogant psychoanalyst. He is willing, in principle, to take any historical claim of the past seriously, to at least weigh it on the scales of his judgment and of the evidence, except any statement concerning the existence or the activities of spiritual powers, angels, demons, gods. For example, he will take seriously the specific accounts of most of the events surrounding the Battle of Marathon, but he will never for an instant entertain any of the claims by these same accounts that various gods had their hand in the outcome of that battle. He will studiously seek to categorize and describe the rites and the religious practices of people of a variety of societies and epochs, noting down every single detail of their own accounts of what they were doing. But he will never for a moment take seriously the account that they themselves gave of why they were doing it. He will impartially accept as possible, that is to say, one category of event, even while he totally dismisses another. Now, he might respond to this by noting that no one presently living, at least no one of good standing, has ever seen, say, a god engage in direct combat in the midst of a war. And in this way he will bolster his position with reference to the common sense of our time. But this begs the question, because in antiquity it was every bit as common for people to suppose the presence and the interference of the gods in warfare and in every aspect of society as it is for us to deny it. The atheist will ignore a great many of the possible explanations for this disjunction between the past and the present. He will focus all of his attention on that single explanation, according to which the ancients were clouded by rank superstition, that they lived in worlds which were bogged in with clouds of ignorance and darkness. The atheist, when he looks at the past, has decided a priori which human experiences he will take seriously and which he will not. Now, this strange kind of remove from the very founts of human experience is visible elsewhere in the atheist's view as well. If you ask an atheist, for example, to describe human consciousness, he will point to brain scans or measurements of various chemical levels in the human body. If you ask him what is human emotion, human ambition, human suffering, human meaning, human fear or wonder or hatred or love, he will point you to these same images, numbers, and measurements. He is always standing at a remove from the experience that he claims to base his entire view upon. His destiny is bound up in one of the conundrums of science itself, namely that the empirical, as it's defined by science, has nothing real to do with the empirical, the experiential, as it was naturally and originally understood by human beings of all times. There is nothing empirical about graphs, charts, mathematical equations, and numbers. The scientific empirical is in fact the anti-empirical, something which stands in for the empirical and substitutes it. The atheist is always standing beside himself in a very real sense. He can never come to terms with his actual experience of things, or the actual experience of any of his fellow human beings, at least insofar as he remains within his atheistic view. And this shows nowhere so clearly as in the way that he is bound to interpret certain of the experiences of other human beings, and indeed in many cases even his own experiences. Now, as I stated before, I think that one of the truly laudable features of atheism is the desire, common to most atheists, to be intellectually honest and to see the world for what it is. And I think that one of the tragedies of atheism is that it inevitably yields precisely the opposite results. Over time, the atheist is transformed, subtly but inevitably, into a mere advocate for his own limited beliefs and nook perspective. He becomes remarkably adept at forcing the facts to fit his view, or to ignoring those which don't. And I think that this is a sad but necessary feature of the atheistic worldview. Now, in the comments to my last video, one of the major objections among those who disagreed with me concerned my use of the words atheistic worldview. I was informed in no uncertain terms that atheism has no worldview, and I can agree with this up to a point. Atheism, at its root, is simply a rejection of the assertion that there are gods. It does not contain a set of dogmas or doctrines. It does not indicate any kind of ought or ought not for the human being. It does not necessitate a totalizing set of conclusions about the nature of the world or of the things in the world. But it does have necessary and inevitable moral, psychological, and spiritual ramifications for all who hold to it. The idea that one can simply excise the belief in God from one's worldview, and that this leads to no further logically necessary consequences, is to my eyes baffling. Now, atheists are various. They believe a surprisingly wide variety of things about the world. What unites them is what I'm going to call a unique spiritual outlook. One might say that there's a kind of intellectual tendency to the atheist, a familial resemblance which holds among most, if not all, atheists on account of the fact that they all proceed from a common starting point. But that, I believe, is precisely what a worldview is, as opposed to, say, a religion or a philosophy or a way of life. I would equally say that theists, despite their perhaps still more various differences, share a common worldview, and this worldview sets them apart from the atheists. Now, the use of these words is a little nebulous. We could speak of worldviews within worldviews. I might have a worldview as a theist and another more specific worldview as an Orthodox Christian. Perhaps a better way of speaking about this would be to speak of the atheist world sense. A kind of sense of the way things are, a sense of the contours of the world, a sense of how we are to approach the things of the world, both intellectually and as human beings. This atheist world sense is the summation of a great many subtle conclusions and inevitable consequences of the atheist position. And it produces a kind of outline of the world in which we live, one which seems to me to be, quite frankly, tremendously difficult to justify. And I think that the difficulty in justifying this position is simply obscured today by the number of people who take it for granted. Now, atheists quite famously take religious people of all kinds to task for making extraordinary claims without providing proportionate evidence. But to my eyes, the atheists cannot exempt themselves from the same charge. Their view, so far as I'm able to make out, necessitates the belief in an articulable, ordered cosmos, which has a kind of spontaneous and inexplicable being, which has given rise to life, a phenomenon which displays characteristics starkly counter to its fundamental premises, and which has, by these same utterly against-the-grain tendencies, resulted in a being, the human being, capable of comprehending himself and his existence and the nature of the world in which he lives. At the same time, atheism demands a kind of rejection of the baseline reality of the things that most fundamentally make up this same human being: his feelings, his purposes, his moralities, his internal experience of the world, and his religious instincts and experiences. It demands, in short, that we turn our human experience on its head, supposing that what is most evident and nearest to us is in fact falsest, while what is farthest away and most alien to our immediate experience is truest. That is an extraordinary sense of the world, the most extraordinary of any of which I'm aware. And to my eyes, it would demand, if not evidence, for evidence in such a case can't be provided, then a philosophical justification, which most atheists, for whatever reason, think they are simply not obliged to offer. So much then for my critiques of atheism. I should probably mention, perhaps I should have mentioned in opening, but I will mention in closing, I was an atheist for many years of my life, for the better part of my adult life. And that experience has certainly in some way colored my approach to the question of atheism. In the video that you've just watched, I've made some attempt to articulate some of the limitations that I see in my prior atheistic views. I don't know to what extent I've been successful, given that I'm dedicated to the truth, and that, as I've said before several times over the course of this video, atheism as a world sense involves a very deep dedication to the truth. If I've managed to further the conversation a bit, or to open up some question which might be of interest for any one of you, I will already consider that to be full payment for my modest efforts here. And I'd also like to add that in the comment section to my last video, while there were some of the just run-of-the-mill, utterly dismissive comments that one expects, unfortunately, from any kind of internet forum, I found a great many highly intelligent, empathetic, and careful responses by individuals who have clearly given these matters a great deal of deep thought. Whatever our disagreements, and they are many, I have nothing but respect for such people. And I hope that they will continue to follow my roving channel and to set me right when they see me straying too far. In the present case, not least of all. I mean, who knows? If we stay in each other's case long enough, then some one of us might decide to come back to good sense, wherever such sense might actually lie. And with that, truly, thank you for joining me for this. I hope that it's been of interest in some way. Please leave me your remarks, your comments, your thoughts, your objections. Why not? Your personal insults down in the comments below. I look forward to some interesting conversation. And finally, let me know what you think my ducks think about all of this. Whose side are my ducks on? Leave me your thoughts in the comments below. With that, friends, farewell to you all, and Godspeed.